Welcome, everyone. This is webinar 2 of this year, and we're focusing on dam performance monitoring, instrumentation and data analysis. And really it's tailored towards smaller earth dams in the province of British Columbia. So my name is Dwayne Tannant. I'm a geotechnical engineering professor at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. And Aaron?
I'm Aaron Hahn. I'm with Interior Dams, and I'm a dam safety engineer.
Okay, so let us begin. So we have almost 2 hours of materials here. It's going to be a bit of a long haul. So first of all, some acknowledgements. The funding for these webinars was provided by the governments of Canada and BC under the Canada Agricultural Partnership. We have curated a series of images and photographs, many of them of our own taking, but we've also collected resources from other sources, and they're indicated on the screen. We acknowledge that contribution. You know, we realize that BC is committed to maintaining and improving dam safety, and that these webinars are part of that action. Aaron and I aren't government employees, and so the opinions expressed here in this webinar are those of our own opinions and not necessarily those of the governments of Canada and BC. And this webinar is being recorded for possible inclusion on the BC Dam Safety website in the future. We're going to look at, very briefly, tie this webinar back to some of the regulatory requirements through the sort of minimum monitoring frequency that one should be using for their dams. There's a little bit of a background on dam monitoring, the basic knowledge that's important. And then we will switch over to looking at the typical types of instrumentation and the techniques to measure that instrumentation for small earth dams. We'll end up looking at how we would plot measurements that we do obtain. How do we plot it? And then how do we use those plots to potentially detect abnormal conditions? And we're especially looking for conditions that are giving us signs that a dam may be moving towards a more unsafe state of performance. We want to be able to use our monitoring to guide us to, maybe repairs or maintenance activities. So I'll let Aaron start with a little bit of an overview on the regulatory requirements.
Yeah, so we'll try to fly through this, but we do want to summarize the regulatory requirements. I would say they are great minimum requirements. So to start, this is right out of the short, roughly 30-page regulation. So pertaining to instrumentation, an owner of a dam must do all of the following. So install the instrumentation necessary. So we're going to talk about necessary a little bit today. So the second is maintain or replace that necessary instrumentation. But why are we putting it there? Because we want to collect readings from the instrumentation so we can analyze, interpret it. So really the goal of these main, simple minimum requirements is detection. And that was the last point of Dwayne's last slide. So today we're going to be focusing on how do we do all these things so that we can detect and make our dams safer. Okay, so this is the last table of the dam safety regulation. So it pertains to the minimum frequency of sort of dam safety activities that you have to do or should do as a dam owner. So this is kind of a simplified version, so we can fit it in a nice slide, but the actual text out of that red box there is collect readings from instrumentation. So right from the last slide there, collect readings from the instrumentation and analyze and interpret the readings. So, and it's recommended to do that annually as a minimum. So there's a little star there because in the regulation, those minimum requirements are sort of mandated by the regulation, but it does give you flexibility that when you put your operation maintenance surveillance manual in or together, you want to think critically about, well, one, is it necessary? Because if it's not necessary, you don't have to put it in. And well, if you don't have any, then you can't really analyze, interpret the data. So those are the things you want to put in your OMS. But you may have a more complex dam where you have more instrumentation and it needs to be done more than annually. You need to be collecting this stuff every time you're surveillancing your dam, right? It could be weekly, or maybe it's continuously, depending on the instrumentation you have. So we're going to talk about all this a little bit more as we go on today. So these are just some hypothetical questions. You're welcome to chime in on the chat, but I'm posing these questions to start thinking about where we're going to go today. So do you know how your dam could fail, right? How could it fail? Is it going to be internally eroded, overtopped? If it's internally eroded, well, how should it perform, right? What sort of seepage maybe should I see? Do you know that? Do you know how much seepage you should see? Is it so these are some of the questions we want to answer today. What instrumentation, if any, do you have on your dam? So some of you don't have some of you do, some of you do, but you don't know where it is. So these are some of the things we want to hammer out and highlight today. Is the instrumentation adequate for your dam? And how do you measure and how do you use that data, right, for those instruments that you're bringing? And so OMS, your operation and maintenance surveillance manual, it's like your user manual. It should list all those pieces of instrumentation. It should itemize them, show them where they are if you have them, but also what to do with them. Because what if you pass this on to another operator, maybe your business and the dam along with it, gets taken over by your children. These things are much easier if we have them all documented in an OMS. So regulatory requirements, what instrumentation is necessary? So remember, a dam owner is responsible to fulfill the dam safety regulation. So we need to install the instrumentation necessary. So that's a loaded question. It's really easy to understand, but it's a little more difficult to figure out what exactly that turns into in terms of actions. So if you do not need instrumentation to demonstrate safety, I would say do not install it. Installing instrumentation can be invasive, and if installed, you can have a regulatory requirement to maintain, read, analyze, and interpret. And there's the other 2 points of the first regulatory slide I said. So we want to collect the data we need so that we can understand that it's performing safely. If we do not need that information for that, putting it in isn't really helping. I would say it's worse, even if you can find some benefit from that instrumentation, putting that instrumentation in and not monitoring it is worse than just not putting it in. So we're going to continue on. So we have to ask ourselves a few questions to sort of figure out how we go about this. So first question, how can my dam fail? So we have some statistics from many sources. A lot of them are very similar. These ones particularly are from CDA, 2007 document. So internal erosion and overtopping are kind of the main things. So internal erosion is one we can monitor. We can monitor with our eyes, and we're going to talk about that. But first, understanding how our dams can fail can really help us direct our instrumentation planning. So a dam can fail in many ways. Studies have shown these, right? Overtopping, internal erosion, and slope instability. So where should I focus monitoring? So this is going to be a different and case-by-case scenario, but overtopping is often caused by blocked or undersized spillways. So therefore, if spillways are adequately sized and maintained, your dam performance monitoring will typically focus on internal erosion and piping, same thing, and slope instability. So this is a real generalized comment. I wanted to put it in there because most of the small dams we're talking about, we have static spillways that are ungated. Typically, they should be reviewed and already adequately sized. And apart from looking for erosion and things like that, the actual instrumentation is usually focused on these two pieces. So,
Aaron, that's also our previous workshop was focusing on the maintenance aspect.
Yes.
And some of that maintenance aspect was to ensure that that spillway can convey your design inflow flood or something. So
Exactly.
it's maintenance and keeping that spillway clean is the strategy, and not necessarily monitoring. I guess you're monitoring with your eyes in terms of does it need maintenance or not, but there's not much in terms of instrumentation required.
That's absolutely right. And I also want to point to, where should I focus? Many of your dams are lower consequence, maybe even minor dams. But if your dams are of higher consequence, or if you still have all the design documentation, DSRs and design documentation typically review your modes of failure. And so looking through that information, it'll give you a better understanding of how your dam can fail, the type of material in it, maybe where there's potential seepage vulnerabilities in your design. That information is really valuable to know what types of things to look for, and also maybe how much seepage is expected. So that's really really useful information. If you have stability modeling in your DSRs, and I'm just going to touch on this, we're going to talk about it more. They'll typically show sections of expected phreatic levels and possibly seepage rates, extant gradients, things like that. But useful information. So what is internal erosion and piping? So this is a photo of the Teton Dam. This is a very well-known case study of internal erosion. What I'm going to do here is just read what is internal erosion. Based on the USBR definition, is internal erosion is the formation of voids within soil caused by the removal of material by seepage. So that's really what's happening. As water goes through your dam, it can erode and cause voids, and then it successively increases the seepage. Internal erosion, probably one of the most common modes of, and there's a couple different types of internal erosion, is backward erosion. I'm going to play this video, and I'll just sort of talk over it as I show it. But you may have a beautiful dam, looks great, may have been there a long time, and one or more types of internal erosion may have been occurring this whole time. Maybe your seepage has slowly been increasing over time. But in a backward erosion type, what you have is the water exiting at the end will carry a little bit of soil as it goes. And as it continues to carry soil, it can create a pipe. Again, remember that definition. It's creating more voids. As the seepage comes, it creates more voids, and it internally erodes your dam. So this can be very slow and really only detectable from monitoring seepage and other things. And then what happens is it forms this failure mode. The formation of that pipe can happen, and then it can continue very quickly. And you'll see that it's actually, this video shows successive failures where the pipe erodes, you get a bit of differential settlement. It might even shut it down, and then it starts to erode again, and then it slumps. And sometimes these can happen successively, even before it rapidly fails.
Maybe I'll just go back to this picture of Teton Dam, because what you're seeing here is internal erosion. There's a pipe that's been forming through this dam.
Yes.
And it's a large dam, right? Much larger than probably most of us here today deal with. And the key thing is, once it gets to a stage like this, you've lost your dam. It'll go in a matter of hours, that whole dam, that pipe expanded through, it collapsed right to the crest of the dam, and the whole reservoir, went down the valley. And this one, unfortunately, caused loss of life. And it's a kind of a classic case example of internal erosion causing a pipe, then causing a breach of a dam. And so, this internal erosion mechanism, there's different subtle differences, different types of internal erosion. They're all a problem that we're concerned about, but here are some sort of classifications: backward erosion, the concentrated leak, contact erosion, and suffusion. And we'll just walk through those briefly to give you some better insight into where these things could occur in your in your dam, in your embankment. So backward erosion, and really it's backward from the downstream. It erodes towards the upstream. And in this particular case here, we have a very simple schematic of a dam that has a lower permeability core material, maybe a granular filter, but you can have the water that's flowing through this embankment and through this dam and through the core start to gather up small particles of soil and carry it into the filter, then flush it right out of the dam. And so these pipes will start and they can grow up through your core and then maybe through the shell of your dam. Of course, when you're standing on the surface, taking a look at your structure, you might not even know what's happening unless you are doing some sort of maybe having some water level measurements, piezometers in your dam, or if you're monitoring seepage coming out of the toe, and not just the quantity of water, but whether that water is carrying soil particles or not. So that's one type of internal erosion, this backward erosion. And here's simply another example. So this is an interesting little sketch. So there's your embankment, a little bit of a cutoff. But if the foundation soils for your dam allow particles to carry through, you can have the pipe form completely underneath your dam. Mm-hmm. And so you got essentially a tunnel that's gradually being created by the seepage flow, and then that'll eventually cause distortion and strain in your dam and maybe collapse of your dam. So these features don't have to necessarily be confined to the structure that you built. They could be present in the foundation for that structure. And we might have to be looking some meters downstream of the toe of your dam to find this feature. And the webinar last Saturday, we were talking about looking at boils that were occurring like this, and potentially that was associated with water not going through the dam, but going under the dam. Still a concern for the safety and stability of your dam. You can have some of that seepage through your dam kind of concentrated. This looks like a low-level outlet that's probably going through your dam. And these structures that penetrate through your dam are often associated with a little bit more enhanced seepage along the outside of those structures, and they could be carrying particles out. And so you essentially get a pipe that progresses back into your embankment, but caused by concentration of flow along some sort of defect, effectively, the defect being your low-level outlet, and the soil around that outlet may not be adequately compacted or the wrong kind of material. So you have to be watching for that. And of course, when these things occur, you get differential settlement, you get maybe some cracks, and these concentrated leaks don't have to be associated with low-level outlet. There could be things like animal burrows or rotting tree roots that again concentrate the seepage at one specific location, and that starts the piping process and the internal erosion. We often have different types of materials in our dam or between our dam and our foundation. So they might have different grain sizes, and if the grain size distributions of these materials that are contacting each other aren't compatible with each other. What I mean by that is if the finer grain materials are able to be easily mobilized by flowing water and then travel through the coarser grain material, we will gradually lose fine materials, and we start to create a piping failure a void starts being generated in the fine grain materials. So we have to be a little bit cognizant of that, and this one's showing it between the dam and the foundation. That's where it's occurring, but you can sometimes have it between, let's say, your core and your filter if you don't have an adequately designed filter. The grain sizes were not the appropriate size ranges, and these processes, they can take, it can start off very slowly and take years, maybe even decades, and gradually removing small particles. Maybe the particles are removed more vigorously when the reservoir level is high, creating higher seepage pressures. But once it gets to a critical state, then it'll start to really accelerate, and that you end up creating a void or a pipe through your dam, and that's usually going to lead to a dam failure. A little bit similar, but suffusion is where your soil has some big particles and some quite small particles, and maybe it's sort of got a lot of big particles, no intermediate size particles, and then very small particles, and then the flowing water through this particular grain size distribution will grab the small ones and start to move them along, and so you're removing soil. And in doing so, you're actually creating the voids, increasing the void ratio in the remaining soil, and more water will want to flow through there. And before you know it, maybe even the bigger particles start to be carried along. So we have to be aware of that as another mechanism. Again, process could take a long time to gradually develop, and then it'll accelerate as it leads up to a breach of the dam. So, there are sort of guidelines, and here's one from the International Commission for Large Dams, but it's a little guideline to say what type of failure mechanism might be common for different types of dams. And I am guessing that for the participants here today, most of you are probably dealing with a homogeneous, possibly unzoned, well, if it's homogeneous, it'll be unzoned earth fill dam. You may have earth fill with some rock shells or rock toe, but if your dam is of that construction, that sort of type of dam, like this little table says, the potential to control internal erosion is quite limited. There's little or no control. Therefore, that type of dam can be vulnerable to internal erosion. And we're kind of highlighting here that that's probably applicable to most of our small dams here in this province. So your structures are vulnerable to that type of process, and therefore your monitoring needs to be sensitive and is guided by understanding, well, that's a process that is of concern to me, so I need to be watching for it. You may never have it, but you need to be still watching for it, because as we said, it does take some time for these processes to develop. And I guess one little last slide here, it sort of restates again another table of types of failures, and you can see, and it's breaking dams down between those that were built before the 1950s and those that are built after the 1950s. But nevertheless, piping through the embankment or through the foundation, or even totally through the foundation, all these piping failure modes are causing about half of the dam failures in this particular data set. And so that's why we need to be watching for those failure modes. The overtopping, and if your spillway or your gates don't work, that's kind of probably going to cause an overtopping as well. Those are things that are pretty easy to understand and visualize just by standing at the dam and looking at your spillway and looking at the amount of water that's coming in and whether there's an atmospheric river. Those are really easy things to understand, those failure mechanisms. It's the piping that are a little bit more tricky. And over here, the key message, many types of internal erosion can lead to piping. So it's internal erosion that causes a pipe, a void, a long void, which is the pipe, to be generated through your dam. That then could lead, well, if you get a big void, it's very likely to lead to dam failure. It's really hard to catch it and stop it if you have a pipe that's gone through your dam. And there's certain things that you're going to look for, and it's, as you can see in these little schematics, it's extra seepage they hadn't seen before, an increase in the quantity of seepage, and the seepage itself being muddy or starting to carry sediment with it. So your monitoring has to be kind of watching for these type of processes to occur. Aaron, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. So we're still asking ourselves a few questions. So we're back to question 4. We've answered what is internal erosion. We're still kind of determining what's sort of necessary for instrumentation. But what is a phreatic surface? So once we have answered this question, I think we have some pretty good guidance as to what instrumentation we want. So phreatic surface is where the water pressure in the soil voids is 0. So here's our water surface here. And above that, our water pressure or gauge pressure is 0. And so we're interested in sort of where that level is, the water level. And see here, if you're walking around on the toe of this dam, you'll be able to feel that saturated embankment. It'll be wet, the vegetation will be increased, a number of things, and you'll be able to tell visually that you've touched your phreatic surface. And so if you have a homogeneous dam, you can have a pretty good idea of what this might look like. We're going to talk a lot more about the seepage, in this case through the foundation, but generally embankment stability decreases if your phreatic surface increases. So let's look at this design here for a second. If you had a drain down on the bottom here, if you can see my mouse, that phreatic surface will come down as it drains the embankment, and it'll increase your stability. And that would be a positive, right? But we're going to talk a little bit about how that level could come up and down, what may cause that, and what that may mean for the safety of your dam. So we're going to show you a little video, excuse me, of what the phreatic surface looks like, but also what the seepage, because there's always water flowing through your dam, and the pore water pressure, or the head, will be decreasing as it flows through the soil. So this is a simple sand homogeneous material. I'll play the video and we'll see what the dye does. So hopefully everyone can see that. The dye gets drawn in, and this was just injected in the sand there. And as the water comes, it carries that along with the water. So I'm going to play it again here, and you can see that, if you can see my mouse, sort of along this top here is sort of where the pressure is 0, right? And then it kind of comes out. And if you're walking around, you probably feel that, squishy embankment there. So, trying to go to the next slide there. So here we've drawn in the phreatic surface. So what you see is the water level, the phreatic surface, and it shows a parabolic line here, which is sort of what would be expected. And then at the end of the parabolic line, it just kind of comes straight out. So there's ways to calculate and determine what this is. There's different methods, but there's your phreatic surface there. So we're going to go through a little bit of basic theory about water pressure or pore water pressure and seepage through embankment dams. And we're going to go through some simple examples, and they'll get a little bit more complicated. If you do get confused, we can talk about this a little bit over our chats, and certainly at the end of, and we can even go back, but this will be recorded as well. You can always jump back. So a little bit of theory here. So here's an illustration of water pressures. Let's assume that everything that's orange is like a concrete or some sort of impervious material. Water's not going through it, just for simplicity. So let's pretend we have a conduit or a layer of a pervious material, maybe a sand or something like that, and we're going to try to understand what the pressure does in through that material. So the example is going to start with, you can see my mouse. We have 6 feet of head differential between the upstream and the downstream. So let's pretend you're pouring water, or flow of water is maintaining that water level at 6 feet. So what happens is some water flows through here, is maintained, and that same flow comes out the other side. So we have kind of a static or a steady state condition where water going in goes through the sand or through the embankment and out the other end, and 6 feet is maintained. So moving forward, okay, so what is the expected piezometer level? So feel free to chime in. You can send the message to me or to everyone if you want to give away your answer. So we talked about head pressure, or the pore water pressure in the embankment, it will decrease as it flows through the soil. So in this case, it's a very simple situation. It's quite linear, the phreatic surface, and we have 6 units of length across the upstream side of the dam to the downstream side of the dam. And coincidentally, we have 6 feet of head. So as that goes down, can anyone tell me what the piezometer level is? Right, so in this case, we have 1 foot of pressure head loss for each 1/6. And so we had someone say 1/3, 2 feet, and both are correct. We have 2 feet. That is our expected value if it is performing well as expected, right? We would expect 2 feet of head pressure in that standpipe piezometer in this particular case. So it's going to start getting a little more complicated. So hopefully everyone can stay with me. Okay, so we talked about internal erosion mechanisms, right? Backward erosion. Let's pretend this is unfiltered. We have that flow going through soil, and let's pretend it's eroding. So it's eroded some material out of our kind of conduit or layer, and some of that sand has maybe even been caught in a V-notch weir or something. So same, or maybe we have our flow still being maintained through the dam and back out the other side, and some of the materials come out. So here's a clue of what we might expect at that piezometer. Let's pretend, if you see my mouse, the erosion has already made it to the location of the piezometer, just a little bit. And remember, there's not always a lot of flow going through the dam. There's really not a lot of flow going in or out of the piezometer. So it just sees what that sort of gauge pressure is at that location. Can anyone tell me what we would expect at the piezometer in this case? Yep, we see less, and we see 0. So both, we're getting all right answers here today. The piezometer level will match the tailwater elevation in this case. And saying less is correct too, because oftentimes maybe you've got a filter in there, a little bit of sand, you still got a bit of a head drop with that flow. So, but a simplified example, 0 feet. So seepage flow and velocity will increase in this case as well. So we'll see a decrease in our piezometer and an increase on the flow at this location. So what we see now is this slope, or phreatic surface, has steepened. And what we have too is a higher exit gradient through this material here. And it's likely that that will start to increase and will increase exponentially in this particular case. So we have a lot of dams too that are more of a granular material. If a piping starts to occur, it may not hold a roof. It'll collapse, and it'll sort of pinch the pipe again.
Aaron, can you go back to that previous one? So if it doesn't collapse, and if that pipe is sort of more or less self-sustaining as a tunnel, you can easily see why it's going to accelerate. It's going to get faster and faster and faster, because at the tunnel face, if you call it a tunnel, it is a tunnel made by piping. The seepage gradient goes up higher and higher and higher. So that's why, as he says, it accelerates. Once the process starts, it's nasty because it gets worse and worse, particularly if it doesn't collapse. Now you can go on to your collapse. Thank you.
Exactly. And we're going to talk about piezometers too, where they're discrete points, because what if this is happening a few meters to the left or to the right? What do we see, right? Maybe the piezometer will be less. It won't be 0 anymore. And so that's a question too. Where do we place these? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But what I'm trying to show you is that sort of how a piezometer can respond. So what happens if we have a material type where it plugs? Or maybe you have a situation like this where it hasn't actually eroded, but down at the bottom here, maybe your filter is getting clogged up, right? Maybe your filter is doing what it's supposed to do, but it's starting to clog, and it's increasing that phreatic surface, perhaps, or what is it doing, right? So what happens here? Can anyone tell me? It's pinched it off. It's pinched it off. You essentially have a larger conduit and now going into a smaller one to filter through. So I kind of gave the answer away. The phreatic surface is going to increase, right? So seepage flow will decrease, right? The flow will decrease. But even if it decreases, the velocity in that plug, in that narrow area, will still, it'll be faster, right? It's almost like pinching a hose, right? You might get less flow overall coming out of your weir down here, but you'll have some increased velocity potentially here, and certainly increased gradient. And it's worse than before. So we think, okay, we arrest that seepage, and in this case it collapsed, right? Great, we arrested the seepage, but we actually have a worse case than we had before. If I went back 2 slides, that blue line here, the steepness of this grade, if it's unconfined, you have a high exit gradient. So, and then what we have now is we have actually a steeper slope here coming to this end. So in this case, we have an increased exit gradient and steeper than before. So what I expect is successive failures. We're going to look at now a slightly different example, a little more complicated, but first we're going to visualize sort of what that looks like. So here, like before, they've put some dye in, kind of blobs here underneath, and then they flow water in here to maintain the water levels, and then we can see how it flows. And so now in this case, if you had an embankment in between, you'd see a phreatic surface, but this is just a cutoff. But here we can see flow actually takes these very predictable paths through the embankment. And you'll notice, oh, this is taking a lot longer to get over there, which is true because you have higher velocities here. So I'm going to show that again so people can get a sense of how water flows through soil. We had a question, so would stress cacks be what to look for if no piezometers? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. If you definitely may see some internal erosion. If internal erosion is happening, you could have differential settlement. Differential settlement could cause cracking. Those types of things are indicators that there could be something going on. Could be excessive settlement in your foundation. So this is kind of like the last example. You still have a impermeable dam, in this case concrete. You also have a cutoff wall here. And there's your seepage paths, kind of like that yellow dye and the purple dye we were showing. And in this case, it's kind of like before. Now we have 16 feet instead of 6, and we have 0 over here. And so it's divided up, just like it was divided up in 6. Now it's divided up in 16ths. And you can see how the flow flows through each one of these paths, and that it drops 1 foot of head on each kind of equal potential, pore water pressure line. And you can actually, if you go through this, you go 16, 15, 14, you go all the way down here, somewhere between 7 and 6, this piezometer is. So that'd be 6.5. And it might be like that as well as you go down. Dwayne, you have any comments on this one?
Yeah, well, it's interesting looking at the other piezometer at the toe of the dam, because so if the tip of this open pipe is sitting here, we would record a 2-foot higher water level in that open standpipe piezometer compared to, say the tailwater here. If that piezometer tip was over here, I would also get 2 feet. If it was over here, I'd also get 2 feet. So anywhere along this line, if the bottom of that piezometer was along this line, I record 2 feet of water level in that piezometer higher than H equals 0. Mm-hmm. However, just take the same piezometer and put it right here. If you were to just move this piezometer so the bottom is right here, it would only record 1 foot above, and if it was down here, it would record 3 feet above. So when you have water exiting around the bottom of a dam, depending on where the tip of your piezometer is, you can have quite different water levels in it. And you have to understand that when you're interpreting these piezometer levels, particularly anything that's down near the toe, if you have a relatively impermeable dam. Here, of course, the tip, if the tip was here, 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 or here, it doesn't really matter. It's always going to rise up to about 6.5 feet. And of course, over here, if it was along this line, it's going to rise up to about 5 feet. But having that kind of understanding as to what's the expected piezometer level for your structure is important, so that if you start to see values in your piezometer that are higher or lower than what's expected, you also should have an idea of what might be causing that change in piezometer level. I'll let you go
All right,
into
I think
it.
I got control again. So slope and instability example. So now we know a little bit about seepage and how seepage is directly connected with pore water pressure. This is an obvious case where it's not in good shape, but you know, what do we see here? We see elevated reservoir level, right? We see it's right at the crest. We see seepage, you know, some seepage exiting at the embankment, even if it's high in the embankment. We have a saturated ditch there. We know we have a high phreatic surface. You know, how does this affect stability? In this case, it's obviously time to initiate a dam emergency plan. Excuse me. But maybe somewhere between this looking fine and here, there could have been a time where maybe there were some indications as to it is time to activate our DEP and avoid a failure. So I'm going to play this video, and it gives us a sense of, you know, is it slope stability, internal erosion? It's kind of, and then also overtopping. So we see a little bit of overlap of failures here, but when it starts to fail, it fails very rapidly. And now that we have a slope failure, we have some slumping and some lost freeboard, and then the erosion. So you can see how even if the failure modes are a little bit different, a lot of these you know, these pieces, like the understanding the phreatic surface and seepage, they're all connected. And just like that other person said, what about cracking? Well, you know, if you see some of these things, maybe cracking is, you know, part of it, or all these things are connected to the safety and performance of your dam.
If you ever see seepage coming out of your dam way up near the crest, be concerned, be very concerned. It's time to initiate your dam emergency plan. It's time to try to get water out of that reservoir as quick as possible. Okay.
I don't like to see that.
Yeah, we don't like to see that. So we're going to switch over and just kind of look at some different types of instrumentation and monitoring techniques. And of course, you know, again, we were focusing on these small earth dams. And, you know, we have different monitoring for maybe slightly different purposes, but for performance monitoring for safety aspects of dams, you know, it's pretty standard that we would want to be monitoring the reservoir level. Seepage flows through, underneath, or around the dam. And if you have piezometers, the piezometer levels. So those are all key things. And of course, those are all kind of water related things that we're monitoring. And if there's displacement or movement of that dam, and for example, those tension cracks are evidence that there is some movement occurring. In that video that we just saw, there is a little bit of a bulge on the dam that's present well before things started to really take off. So, you know, there is always evidence of distress in the dam through dam displacements and movements, but typically they're going to be hard to monitor. And of course, just to support your operations, to make sure you're operating the dam the way you want to operate it, an understanding of what the spillway flows are and maybe outlet flows if you have a low-level outlet. So those are things that should be probably monitored. And of course, there's other types of monitoring and instrumentation available, and what you use and what is deemed to be necessary really does depend on your dam. It's dam specific. So let's come back to to the water related stuff. So why would we want to monitor water levels and seepage? We know that water is going to seep through and underneath essentially all of our dams. But the collection and monitoring and analysis of the water levels and seepage is crucial to understanding what is routine behavior for your structure, right? So we need to get to like a baseline for what is expected levels of seepage, routine levels of seepage. And then now, because we're monitoring, we should now be able to detect changes. When your performance starts to differ from what you would expect, well, now we can detect it because we're actually monitoring for that. And so we need to know what these typical conditions are. And if we have changes from those conditions, they may be indicating worsening dam performance, and the dam is slowly walking towards a state where it might fail. Our visual dam inspection using our most powerful tool, our eyeballs, is obviously very important. And it's got some limitations though. Your visual inspection may not give you quite enough information about what's happening inside of the structure itself. These gradual internal erosion processes are a little bit challenging to pick off through visual inspection. You're more likely to catch them through things like seepage, changes in seepage, and maybe some dirty water coming out of your dam. So visual inspection is important. It's really good for a bunch of other things, but we may need to monitor seepage and water levels to kind of really get an indication of how the dam is behaving internally. So what type of instrumentation could we use? And so this little cross section showing a variety of different things. So let me just walk through them. So you may have a staff gauge that you use to record the reservoir level. And really, every time you visit the dam, you probably should make a quick note of what that is on some sort of document. If you don't have it on your staff gauge, maybe you have some markings on your valve stem, and you use that as your means to measure the reservoir level. So lots of people have different ways of doing that. It doesn't have to be high tech, but it has to be consistent, and you have to be able to read it easily when you're on a dam. And even if your valve stem protrudes past some sort of like a concrete anchoring mechanism or steel mechanism, you can just measure how far that thing sticks in or out. That might give you some indication of how open your slide or your gate valve is at your low level outlet. So those are pretty simple things that we probably have on most of our dams. Piezometers, whether we place piezometers near or through the dam, through the crust, or maybe near the toe. And then remember, we have to give some thoughts to where do we want to measure water pressure? Do we want to actually measure it in the core or in the foundation? So there are various considerations, but we can use piezometers to monitor that. Not necessarily monitoring this phreatic surface. We're going to be monitoring pressures in the foundation or pressures at the toe. You may have a seepage blanket or drains. You may have V-notch weirs, so we can use the V-notch weirs to measure the quantity, the flow rate of water coming out of your dam, and you have various types of weirs or V-notches. Perhaps in this area, we can look at, are we building up sediment in some sort of structure? So is the water carrying out soil and it's maybe dropping it off in kind of a calm water area here before it leaves leaves down the stream? So look for sediment being carried out of your dam. And then there may be various things on your dam that you can survey to figure out their position in space and over time. Things like even this thing is pretty obvious thing. You can put a point on top of this, the top of your valve stem and just track the location of that thing over time through surveying methods. when we say surveying, your eyeball is actually pretty good when you're standing up, looking down the crest of your dam or the downstream or upstream face. If you're starting to see any distortion or bulging, you need to make a note of that. So, because you are effectively surveying it, not very quantitatively, but you can see things as the shape of your embankment changes.
Dwayne, actually, in your last slide, I wanted to point out one thing.
Sure.
We had talked about discrete points and that big piezometer right in the middle, how Dwayne said, oh, you might be, collecting it in the foundation, which might not be your phreatic surface. You may also, if you're putting these in later, you may want to nest piezometers where in the same hole you'd put one in your foundation if you're willing to drill through your core all the way through your foundation. But you could put, one in the embankment halfway up. You could put one further up. Exactly. Like what Dwayne said, with those curves, you may want to actually read it at multiple locations and not just one. So
I've got a poll for you. So what we got? 5 questions. And it's a yes, no, or maybe sometimes, or don't know. I give know the answers. So I'm going to activate this poll. Do you have some way of recording your reservoir level? I was expecting a pretty high yes percentage there. And even those that said no, well, that's a real easy low-hanging fruit to find some way of measuring that, measuring and recording your reservoir level.
And sometimes it's just a rock, where it's in the reservoir. You're kind of like, it's about a third, right? It's about a third full.
Yeah, I saw one example where they had a series of rocks, big ones, laid down in the reservoir, and each of them had a painted number on them.
Yeah.
And they somehow survived the winter and ice and everything else.
Right. Need binoculars, right? To read them.
Do you have drain pipes or seepage weirs? So it's about a 50-50 there. So that's interesting. So, we got half of the people participating today have, well, maybe it's not, maybe they got one or both of a pipe and a weir. So that's interesting. And we'll be talking a little bit about seepage weirs and drain pipes and monitoring of those. Do you regularly, I guess I didn't define what regularly means, record water flow from those pipes or weirs. And so it's, there's some sometimes there. So of those 50% of the people, they're not always recording the flow. And in some cases, they may be just a quick observation and it says, okay, that's the normal flow, and they don't bother recording it because they didn't think it was important to record. Although best practices would say that you should probably record it anyways. Do you have piezometers? I expected a high percentage not to have them, but it's only 53% of people do not have them. There are some people that aren't too sure whether they have them or not. And so that for those that are not too sure whether you have a piezometer or not, it's probably worthwhile exploring that some more. Sometimes we have piezometers, they're there at a dam, but they're not functioning anymore. They've been pinched off or failed or something. So you think you have a piezometer, but it's a non-functioning piece of instrument. And okay, so we got 31% saying they have a piezometer, and 31% exactly say they have equipment to measure it. That's nice to see that those two things match right up, because if you have a piezometer, you better have equipment to actually measure the water level in that piezometer.
We're going to look at some data at the end of this webinar, and we'll see things like time delays and stuff like that. But the idea is, if you have this equipment and maybe your surveillance is only quarterly, you're really not getting a lot of information that's useful to analyze or interpret. So anyway, we're going to get into that a little bit more later, and certainly more data, it can potentially be much more useful. So that would be one benefit.
And that comment, I want to tie it back to the regulatory table, frequency of instrumentation monitoring. If we go back to that, you're going to find for a lot of dams it was annual. And really, I don't think that's sufficient. I think because we have seasonality in most of our reservoirs, there's low periods of reservoir and there's a spring freshet and all that kind of stuff. I think we should be, for this very simple monitoring like seepage and reservoir levels, you should be doing it and recording it every time you visit the dam. So you start to build that history of normal performance. Simply an annual, I mean, it was a minimum, it's a minimum requirement. Like one measurement a year is not really doing due diligence on the safety and performance of your dam. So, you know, we're talking about vibrating wire piezometers. You know, it's fairly expensive equipment. Here's equipment that you pretty much all have, right? All of us are carrying around a phone these days. On that phone, there's a stopwatch feature. There's a camera. Usually the camera even puts the latitude, longitude, GPS coordinates tagged to your photograph. So here are some typical tools that we all have right now, right today. And we can do things like measure the length of something. We can use it to measure flow through weirs, for example, to get the, and then perhaps if we have a drain pipe that's not gushing out too vigorously, a small container like we have there, a 2 liter or 3 liter container and your stopwatch we can use. Of course, when we're measuring things, documenting our instrument measurements, we want to know the date of the year, because that's important, perhaps the time of the day, but maybe the location. If you have a fairly long dam, tagging the location of where you see some seepage or something by taking a photograph, and the photograph is putting a GPS location really with that photograph that's, you know, it's plus or minus 6 meters or 10 meters. That still may be sufficient to kind of start to tag that location of that observation. The photograph's always really helpful and important. You can take notes right on your phone, either by talking to your phone or you know, typing them in. I guess the one tool, you probably don't want to throw your phone into the water to measure the temperature, even though it could do that. But if you had a waterproof phone, you can do that. But maybe you carry along a thermometer just to get maybe both the air temperature, your reservoir temperature, and maybe even your seepage water temperature. Sometimes that could be useful information. So it doesn't have to, you don't have to spend, the bottom line here for a lot of this stuff, you're not spending any money whatsoever because you already own all of this stuff. So we did have some people that were saying they are not recording their reservoir levels. And so here's some examples of what people have done. You know, they've placed these staff gauges up. It's kind of handy if you have some sort of vertical structure close to your dam or your spillway or something that you can see. So you can use staff gauges. And you have to be, you know, these things don't last forever. That's one thing. They tend to corrode or get ripped off by maybe ice or something. And if you were to replace it, make sure your new one is lined up perfectly with what the old one was, so we have continuity in that data over time. We talked about you know, other ways. So here's, you know, I think these holes happen to be at 1-inch intervals. So perfect. You can just kind of count holes and they tag on some foot markers and keep, you know, put that into the reservoir. Tape measure, maybe with respect to some fixed point that's on a piece of concrete. Pretty low tech, a piece of steel with a nut welded to the top. And I guess that nut is at what level, Aaron?
I think that spray painted top there is the full water level, but so, you know, I suppose the photos to show whatever works, right?
Yeah, whatever works.
That one wasn't that convenient because if you want to know, you have to get your boots wet. So you gotta, like, if you want to know exactly, right? Yeah. But I mean, the idea is that there are lots of low tech options.
Of ways. You guys could easily come up with one, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's some more examples where some fairly big, bold lines on this concrete structure where it goes from the wheel down to the gate. So the whole thing is indicated. So you just have to walk down and kind of eyeball where the reservoir level is. Of course, this paint doesn't last forever, and you want to repaint it before you can kind of lose the markings. And then of course you have to do that whenever the reservoir is drawn down. I'm going to just briefly sort of talk about some seepage collection methods that we typically have for earth dams. And so really we've got, and it was interesting, a lot of people commented on that they had weirs or drains. So they might have these type of features in their dam. So you could have, so here's our cross section of our dam, and maybe it has a lower permeability core with a cutoff trench. On the downstream side of that core, we often place a chimney drain. So if this core is made out of, if you're lucky and you got clay, if it's clay, this would be the drain is a granular, sand and gravel drain that's placed there, and it could then continue off as a blanket drain. And then you may have a toe drain that's running parallel to your dam at the toe. So all of these things that where my mouse is moving are designed to kind of collect water. Then eventually that water is going to be carried out and hopefully past something like a V-notch weir, where you can measure the quantity of that water. And some of our best practices for our dams are to put in some of these filters. The idea being the water level up in the reservoirs will plummet very down through the core, and then the phreatic surface of the water table in the dam should be way down here, which really helps improve the downstream stability of that embankment. And these, we want to make sure these filters continue to function over time and they don't get clogged up with, sometimes you get slime, organic material starting to plug up your drains. And this is just a little bit of a zoom in of what this toe drain might look like. They don't have to be huge structures for some of our smaller dams. So, in terms of the dimensions, they're not very big here. So this drain blanket is really essentially, think of it as sort of a fairly clean sand, maybe a little bit of gravel in it. And then, that you may have ditches near the downstream toe of your dam. And if you can guide that water over a weir, this is a V-notch weir, very beneficial, because suddenly we have a way to kind of, in a very systematic and very controlled manner, measure the amount of flow that's been collected by that whole drainage system at the toe of your dam. So your seepage collection ditches can be quite useful, and it takes a little bit of effort to kind of build a bit of an area to raise the water and have it drop over a V-notch weir. This is not a great example, but it's a typical example of what a V-notch weir would look like. And here's some kind of, I guess, some engineering design, a plan view, and a little zoom in on a cross section of what these things might look like. This structure here would typically be made out of metal, because things made out of wood don't last very long. And I've seen rodents get involved for some reason and chew these things apart too. So it's usually a thin, sharp edge piece of metal, and they don't last forever, so they might have to be replaced as corrosion starts to wear them out. Aaron's going to now talk a little bit more about using monitoring tools for seepage.
Yeah, comment on that slide. See how it says shallow? It's only 8 inches, 200 mils deep. If you are putting these ditches in and you don't have them, sometimes you need to be careful that you don't have some kind of a confining layer on the top, and you excavate some real deep channel. It could really affect the way the seepage through under your dam. But just a quick comment there. They don't need to be big, just big enough to collect the water so you can measure and see what it's doing, right? So Dwayne's talked a lot about the collection methods, and now we're going to look about you know, the purpose and sort of how to measure this seepage monitoring. So the purpose is we want to measure the seepage to get a sense of what is a normal amount of seepage. And remember, you want to know that relative to your reservoir elevation. So you want to be collecting both things. It's also an opportunity to monitor turbidity. You know, it gives you a chance to have almost a sediment catch, right? So in this case, you have a collection method and you have a V-notch weir. It's kind of a hybrid little method here. You could just have the pipe and a bucket, which works really great. But in this case, you also have a sediment catch. You know, you can look in there and get a sense if there's any fine, you know, sediments in there and if there's anything eroding. So the seepage monitoring allows you to identify changes in seepage condition because you have the flow, but also potentially some sediment. So here's some more examples of how to measure that collected seepage. So we've got the collection types: blanket drains, toe drains, collection ditches. But the idea is to determine seepage flow rates. We want to have something consistent that we can plot at the end of the year and look, you know, kind of look against the reservoir level. So we want to use a weir, an appropriate formula. Could be just like an online calculator. You keep using this. You want to use the same one. Sometimes formulas or the coefficients they use for the sharpness of the weir and stuff do vary. So whatever method you use, make sure it's consistent. So a weir and a formula, let's say, or a bucket and a timer to capture. Bucket and a timer is real simple because if your bucket changes, I mean, as long as it's measuring the volume. So that's the one downside on V-notch weirs. You want to make sure you're doing it the same. So here's some, excuse me, some best practices for V-notch weirs. Typically, you want to be measuring the water elevation, so the head behind that sharp crested weir. So in this case, they're sharp crested weirs, and you can have different types. You can have V notches. You can have V notches at different angles. You can have trapezoidal, rectangular. In this case, this is a larger collection ditch that has, you know, quite a bit of flow through it. So you have a wider rectangular one, and it gives you some guidance as to how far back to put your measurement. If you have really small ones, you could use kind of a wide flat ruler or something in the V. If it's low flows, but higher levels, you will have a drop of head, and you want to be consistent. So here's an example of some of the different angles, and there's a trapezoidal. This one here in the bottom left, I believe it's a special shape so that each incremental elevation notch gives you a linear change in flow. So there's some interesting ones you can do to simplify your monitoring. The key is whatever's practical for you in your particular case. And here's just an example of a couple different sharp crested weirs. So here's a small weir, and here this person's using a ruler and shoving it right in there in a narrow flat ruler. That works really well on low flow. Again, as long as you're getting something that's representative of the head in that channel coming forward, and that you're being consistent. Here's a very similar one on the right side where we see another V-notch weir. This could be problematic if the nap doesn't fall free, but it appears that it is falling free, and you have a little ruler on this piece of wood. So that some examples of what some other people have done.
Aaron, can you go back to that previous slide? You know, when you're doing that, when you're making your measurements, when you first arrive at the dam, you might want to be cleaning out any debris, organic debris near the V-notch, and then wander around the dam and do all your inspections and things, and then come back and do the measurement. Because often organics and leaves and things get kind of trapped there, and you kind of want it to become stable and be clean before you do your measurements.
Yeah, and this particular one, it's an excellent example. We got bugs and stuff, you know, floating dead bug. You know, they kind of accumulate in this little point, but then if the head or the water level increases even 1 centimeter, you clean that out and then measure it, I mean, you're going to have more flow. We're going to talk about some other things that impact these types of things is weather, right? And some other kind of pitfalls to why you get this noise in your measurement in a couple more slides. So here's just a quick example of a formula. And again, if you're going to use an online calculator or something, whatever it is, just make sure you're using the right one for the right angle, and that you're consistently using the same. In this case, this doesn't have like a special C value for the sharpness or something, but just make sure you use you're consistent. And there's an example of an online calculator. It's pretty simple. You can, this is a screenshot of an app. You can download a free app, and you can throw in the angle, and you can get some real values that are easy to compare. So here's a bucket and timer method. So simple, right? Things you need. Well, you need some sort of setup where it can drop into a bucket, and then you just need a timer in a bucket. So how to calculate? Really, it's just the amount of the volume over time. You divide volume by time, and you get your Q. In this case, if you're liters, seconds, you get liters per second. Really convenient method. So here's some photos, and potential pitfalls is, I personally like to always have my frame of reference looking in the flow, in the direction of the flow of water. So left being left, looking downstream, right being right, looking downstream. So you can see this is an example of collecting some water, but here, right? You know, my left or yours, and at this particular dam, we saw the seepage kind of, they keep getting mixed up, right? Because when you're looking at it from here, you're not looking downstream, and it's really easy to mix up. So other potential common issues is, Dwayne talked about bacterial growth. You kind of see this orangey type stuff, sludge in those drains. Again, in this case, I wouldn't clean them and wait. It kind of depends, because the water will, you know, be flowing statically over some of this sludge. So you could measure the flow coming out of them and then clean the drains after, whatever seems to be working in your particular case. So other common issues, we talked about blockage, stuff getting in the V. So you have to clear the V first, because the V, you need the vertical measurement to get the representative value. Drains, not so much. You could measure them and clean them after. And V-notch weirs are notorious for collecting weather data. So always make a note if you have past weather. Sometimes you have these large tow embankment slopes, you know, collection ditches and areas. If the ground was saturated from rain over the evening before, you will have noise in your data. So having those notes helps you later. So always note the weather. And there's a little note there. Would you be concerned if your flow looked like this on the bottom right? I certainly would be, because there may be more going on than just a little bit of sediment coming through. You may have an internal erosion issue on your hands. Okay, so I'm going to pick up the pace here a little bit, just to stay on time. But here's a typical sandpipe piezometer. You can get one of these little dip water tapes. As they go down, they beep. When you hit the bottom, I like that little battery Dwayne added, because I seem to always get out there and then my battery's dead. But these are all little pitfalls that you can run into. Actually, I point your attention to, Dwayne talked about sand filters and location. You can see this particular section shows about 5 feet of sand filter before the bentonite cutoff. So you're really not measuring the discrete point, but you're measuring a large column in that particular case. So that's one thing to be mindful, and Dwayne pointed that to our attention earlier. Here's an example of one. It's got a protective steel cap. It's really useful because people love to stuff garbage down them, and they're really difficult to fix later. So there's an example of one. Here's another example of some. There's the electric tape dropping down. And just another tip where there's potential pitfalls, maybe between people, inconsistencies between people measuring. I often see this where people measure at the top of the piece of PVC, some measure from the lid, so with a straight edge. So whatever you do, make sure it's consistent. I'm going to have a question coming up, just a little test of knowledge in a second here. But here's an example of some standpipe piezometers. The photo on the right, you can see some nested. We've got 2 inside of there, maybe at different depths. I like how the caps were labeled, so don't mix up the caps. But a Beck piezometer, you can go on one of the American websites, and there's a link there. It shows you how to install your own. There's a little, you can see a couple people here just on a little step ladder, putting a shallow, maybe 10 or 15-foot piezometer in, just driving it in. So what you need, a 3/4 inch galvanized pipe. Sometimes galvanized isn't always best in the embankment because it does corrode. But especially if you're looking in the beyond the toe, you're looking for phreatic levels. These work really well. Post hole driver, ladder, some filter material, and I'm talking like the basically like whatever those sheets are you throw in your dryer. You actually use those as your filter. You push them down at measurements. That's actually their guidance, and a steel tip for driving down. So sometimes these are really useful and low tech for some of your small dams. Just to give you an example. Here's some piezometer locations. Dwayne went over this earlier, but I'm just highlighting the piezometers and where some locations where you use these things. So on that little, kind of low-tech, cheap example that might work for some of you, you might want to put a Beck piezometer in the toe, which could be useful. So here's the question. So please feel free to chime in. And feel free to tell everyone if you can figure it out. But what is wrong with this photo? What's wrong with the piezometer? So the clue is items in the photo. So can anyone see what might be wrong with the piezometer? So I'll give it it's below grade. That could be a problem, actually. If it doesn't drain in there, you could, it could be a water collection thing. That's not the answer I was looking for. Maybe give it a couple
Often they are put pretty flush to grade if they're trying to avoid the piezometer being damaged by equipment or people driving over it.
Yeah.
I like the one that sticks up, but you can't do that on the middle of your dam on the crest sometimes because it's in the way of traffic.
Or get hit by a snow plow or something. I've seen that. Sand dunes too high and can fall in piezometer. That's a good point too. Something to be cognizant of. Measuring tape, screw looks like it wants to go in the hole. Yeah, don't drop the screwdriver in the hole.
Yeah, don't drop the screwdriver. Yeah,
it's stuck. All really good things to be cognizant of when you're measuring these, but it's this. I'll show you. If everyone can see my mouse, it's a watertight cap. And actually, in the last couple of photos, I mentioned one that was labeled, right? And I hope they have a little drill hole in them, or I hope there may be an oversized cap, so they just kind of sit on top and aren't airtight. But think about it, right? If you have a straw and you put it in your drink and you cover it with your finger and you lift it up, keep doing up and down, it's not measuring anything. What you're doing is you're causing an airlock in the pipe. Gasketed seal won't allow for atmospheric balance, and that's exactly right. So they probably answered just as I was about to say. So make sure you don't put a cap like that on it. And if you do, just drill a hole in it. Caps are great because they keep the sand out like other people caught. But we want to think, now that we understand what we're trying to measure and how we measure it, it's all these little details that sometimes really throw off for analyzing, measuring, and interpreting later. So you want to be cognizant of all these. So Dwayne, you're up. I think we're good for time, but I want to keep moving.
Okay. So that sort of our quick overview of piezometers themselves, and I just wanted to zip back to this one, right? So the advantage of this is you're looking at the drilling and the installation all happening at the same time. There is no drilling.
That's right. Really low invasive, not invasive.
Pound it in. At the tip of this galvanized pipe is this thing.
Yep.
And then once it's down, you then lower a steel rod inside and punch this out.
That's right. Yeah,
so that
just a
now
piece of rebar.
It can talk to the soil at the tip of that rod. So it's about as low tech as you can go, and of course is limited to relatively short piezometer lengths and the right kind of material where you can manually pound the thing into the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But for some people that have no monitoring at all, it might be a step forward to get some data. Particularly if you have, if you get some unusual seepage occurring at your downstream toe, this gives you a little bit more insight as to what might be happening.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So switching from piezometers to deformations, there's a few of the dams that I've looked at have had some dams that have been made way before I was born. They had survey monuments attached to the structures. So these are relatively large dams here in the Okanagan, but if you do happen to have brass monuments, take advantage of them, because they're probably, hopefully, in a fairly stable environment, and you can always add your own. Of course, surveying these things in is going to probably require a surveyor and some fairly expensive equipment. But if it was important enough to monitor deformations, some sort of permanent survey marker is really the way to go. This is actually a monument being installed in a spillway here. So we have these so-called survey monuments, but they could, it could be the corner of a piece of concrete or a hunk of steel that's more or less permanent. There could be a settlement rod, and I think I have some pictures coming up of those. And if you really need them to understand deformation of your dam, you can have slope inclinometers installed. Here's some examples of survey points. Essentially a piece of rebar driven in, and this is a spec, and they want it to go down about 3 meters. And that's pretty hard sometimes to get a piece of rebar to go that far, but so maybe it's 3 meters or refusal. The key thing about survey points is if it's a piece of steel, if it's too shallow, freeze thaw, things can jack that thing. It can move vertically, move around. So you really want to get it down nice and far into the ground. And really then we only care about what's happening at the top. That's our survey point. And this particular one has a nice little cap that goes on with a little dimple so that they can be very precise about their surveys. A piece of rebar with a take your chisel and a hammer and pound a dimple into it. That's good enough as well if you really care about kind of millimeter accuracy. There's an example, right? So this is maybe more typical. So that rebar is pounded well into the ground. There is a PVC casing around the thing, and there's a cap that goes on top of that to kind of keep it tidy and clean. And it's big enough that it's easy to find, because you got to find these things in the future to do the surveys. So you could put these type of things in there, and you're essentially monitoring the movement of this piece of ground, but measured at the top of the piece of rebar. Just briefly, because I don't know if any of you have slope inclinometers, but this is what it is. It's a piece of pipe that has grooves. There's 4 grooves. You can kind of just make them out on the inside of the pipe. These things are installed typically vertically into the embankment. And this tool with these little wheels goes into the groove, and it goes down the casing. And as the vertical orientation of that tool changes, the sensors in here picked it up, very, very detailed changes in tilt. And here's what it might look like. So shortly after installation, the black dots are the baseline readings. And then, maybe a year later, you get these readings, and then you get these readings, and then you get these readings. And you can tell by the cumulative displacements, and they're quite small. These things pick up small displacements fairly well versus depth that, down at this depth, probably around 7 meters below maybe the top of your casing, the ground is shearing. There's a fault or a slip occurring at that depth, and that may trigger some further investigation. So some dams will have these, but probably most of the people participating today may not have those. So I have a kind of little quick mental quiz. You know, what can be measured to help detect these three issues? And you know, these are all pretty common issues. What instruments would we use? And you think about it, well, the first instrument you're using is your eyeballs. Maybe you need to have glasses with those eyeballs to enhance their ability. You're going to use visual inspection. But things like a bulge, if there's a bulge, there's deformation, and maybe deformation can be measured. Clearly the wet area, maybe you can put in a ditch down here to gather up the water, run it through a weir to see if that seepage is increasing over time and whether that seepage is carrying sediment. A sinkhole, well, maybe one person talked about it early on, the void that's being generated here is causing some slumping and cracking, so we may have some tension cracks along the crest or in the face of the dam, and a slough. You know, there's certain things that you can use there. So you're looking for these deformations. You're looking for increases in seepage. Something like this, as shown, if you have a piezometer in your embankment, the water level is likely to go higher in that piezometer because your phreatic surface is probably going up. Again, seepage, sediment and seepage. Depending on where it is, your phreatic surface may be lowered. We saw some examples earlier on how that piping could actually lower the phreatic surface and displacements. Of course, tension cracks and displacements. And there's, you know, the ditches and the piezometers and the sumps and the weirs, all those things. And of course, the visual shows up every time. So you actually can see a lot of things, but to complement your visual inspection, instrumentation can be used. So we're going to switch. So we've given a kind of quick overview of really common instruments that could be used. Now we're going to talk about, okay, analyzing the data collected by those instruments and how might you plot it? Because the plotting of the data is part of the analysis process. And really the intent is to detect changes in conditions, right? But to be able to detect a change, we do need to know baseline conditions. You know, what are our normal conditions? And so again, all of this kind of data we talked about before should be recorded. And Aaron talked about, you know, if you had a period of rainfall, heavy rainfall just before you got to the dam, well, you could expect your dam itself is like a big sponge. It's absorbed some moisture and it may be coming out through your drains, and that higher level of seepage may not necessarily just be seepage through the dam from the reservoir, but just the water from the precipitation or snow melt. So you do want to take note of all of the stuff when you're collecting your data. And things to consider, the reservoir elevation and its variation. It's really helpful to do some monitoring when the reservoir is low, and do some monitoring when the reservoir is high, and maybe all in between. Not always monitor things when the elevation of your reservoir is high. You want the full kind of range of your reservoir elevation, so we can start to pick up some trends and behavior in the instrumentation. Of course, precipitation is seasonal, and we want to look for changes over time. Just going out there and measuring it is not sufficient. You really want to make sure you keep a record of that in a clear way, something that you can go back through time to look at the history of a particular sensor or weir, because we're looking for changes and we need to see that over time. And then if you can do that over time, it gives you some options for taking action if you start to see things deteriorating. So some data. So here's some really typical data. It's a bit maybe hard to see, but the purple line is the reservoir level, and P1, P2, P3 are 3 piezometers. In this particular case, the piezometers actually aren't in the dam itself. They're on the abutment of the dam in this, beside the dam. And, you know, when you're measuring piezometers and reservoirs, you can fully expect that they go up and down kind of together. There's a strong correlation in their response. And we, you know, if you have data, and of course this is data that maybe you guys can't obtain because this is actually acquired, I think, every hour or something. Very, very frequent data that's plotted here, but you can really start to look for little weird changes in the data and try to explore what's causing that. So we want to look for changes in the trend of the values. Maybe a bit more simple. So how could you plot it versus time? The previous plot was also versus time, and it was the head elevation above sea level. Here we have versus time, we have the water level and the piezometer level, the same type of plot. It happens to be just 1 year, and the reservoir goes up, the piezometer goes up, the reservoir goes down, piezometer goes down. Typical expected behavior. A similar type of plot, we got reservoir on one side, but we have seepage liters per second on another side. So, you know, the reservoir goes up, the seepage goes up. Reservoir go down, seepage goes down, quite expected. And a plot like this with seepage versus time, you could look at the area under this curve and figure out, you know, how many cubic meters of water was flowing through the dam at that specific time, and see how it changes versus time. So we do the data analysis to look at these trends. We find that the reservoir level itself is often the biggest driver for all the other instrumentation, seepage and piezometers. So that's why we always want to have that reservoir level measured at the same time as seepage and piezometer. And often we want to plot things like seepage and piezometer levels versus the reservoir elevation. And then once we start to establish some trends, we start to look for deviations from those trends. Mm-hmm. So here's an example. So we've got a cross-section of a dam. There's a reservoir. We got a piezometer installed here and one installed here. And here's the data from those piezometers. And we're plotting not versus time here. So each of these dots comes from a different time. And so over time, we keep adding more and more dots on this plot. And you can see why it's valuable to get measurements of piezometer levels for different reservoir elevations. So we got about a 4 meter variation in the reservoir elevation. And then we can see how the piezometer also varies in response. And we can see for the downstream piezometer, we get a trend line established. There's always a little bit of noise to be expected. And then for the crest piezometer, we also get a trend line established for this kind of homogeneous dam. The interesting thing is, if you project this trend line all the way out to here, and this one out to here, they're intersecting this one-to-one relationship at the level of the low-level outlet here. And that's also kind of expected for a homogeneous, so isotropic dam. So not only are we getting a trend line, we can also say, is that an expected trend line for this type of seepage condition? And the answer in this case is, yeah, it's expected. And the fact that one trend line is steeper slope than the other is also expected. So we can learn a lot. But of course, to get this trend line, that might have taken, you know, a couple of years worth of data to get the points on there, and a lot of visits to the dam to pull off that type of data. So when if you're implementing instrumentation, you want to gather up the data as quick as possible at various reservoir elevations to start to establish those trends. And then as we add more data, and I think Aaron's going to be giving some examples of that, we can start to look for deviations from these established trends. You know, the trends themselves don't necessarily have to be linear. Those trends before were linear. This is a reservoir elevation versus seepage. So with the reservoir both going up and the reservoir going down, and there happens to be kind of a break in slope. And that's simply a function of there's some different geology at different elevations in the foundation and within the reservoir. So, we don't necessarily have to expect a perfectly linear relationship as our baselines. This is normal behavior, and we've established that it's normal behavior by having a history of measurements. And here's one last example of normal behavior. So all your data points are sitting on this kind of plot. It's kind of a reverse plot where reservoir is on this axis as opposed to on the bottom. And so there's a certain reservoir level, this reservoir level where my hand is, our mouse is going back and forth. Once the reservoir drops below that level, the piezometer is not responding. And that's probably because of where that piezometer is placed relative to the reservoir and the dam. So you can create these typical behavior plots for each of your instruments and over a wide range of reservoir elevations. So Aaron now will kind of continue on looking at examples of deviations from established normal behavior.
So here we have an example of data plotted versus reservoir level, just what Dwayne was just showing us, right? So we developed this sort of trend or envelope of noise and what we expect all our readings to be. So in this case, we have some red dots. Assume red values show most recent data. So you've collected, maybe data over a period of a decade, and now you have a few new points. Do we have a problem, right? We see seepage, may have increased. Sediment was observed in Weir. I mean, if you have other indicators like that, okay, you're pretty sure you have a problem. But let's say right now we just see these things, right? A little bit more seepage, a little less piezometer readings. That's when we really want to focus on some of the visuals, and maybe we can confirm that there's an issue. But there's certainly something kind of going on here, especially when two sources of data are sort of both going outside of our expected trends. So here's an example of some real data, two hypothetical points on there that are highlighted. But this is a dam that's been getting measurements, manual measurements over a period of 5 years. So this example is 2014 to 2019. So over here we have our staff gauge, so reservoir elevations, right? We're going from maybe 1257 up to 1260, and that's our spillway level. And we have our piezometer. We're showing one piezometer in this case, and all the points. So what we've done is each year is a different color. So we've got, blue and blue, red and red. And what you'll see is you have blue kind of coming up, and, the reservoir comes up at freshet, April, May, and then it gets drawn down over the year. And see if we compare the same year, the blue year, what you have is the piezometer isn't responding. It's still pretty much empty. Okay, it almost shows, I would say, maybe a 2-week delay or so. But you get a sense of what your delay is when you compare these lines, and then it drops off. And here they stopped measuring in the middle of August. So each year you can start seeing an expected trend. And like Dwayne showed, if you plotted them, you're going to start seeing that line, that very expected line with some noise, say red here. We don't have as much data on this year, 2018, but the reservoir level, was a wet year here in the Okanagan. It carries on. The reservoirs at a higher elevation, and so you would expect it's still coming up, and even with some weak delays, we're still pretty high here on the piezometer. So all expected. But if you're plotting another year, and unfortunately at the end of the year, we have very few data points to establish a trend. But in this case, 2019, you have the reservoir elevation come up, it comes down, and now kind of going into the winter year, it's not really going to change much. And yet, if your piezometer came up, came down as expected, and then all of a sudden you see a high value, I would be, I think I'd be pretty confident that there's either an error in data collection or we might have a problem. So 9 times out of 10, someone probably transposed the numbers. They, read the wrong value on their tape measure or something like that. But that's something I'd want to confirm and not just leave till the next spring, right? So this is an example of what you might do at the end of the year when you plot your data. You want to look at it and also interpret it. And again, the goal here is not to figure out what exactly is the problem, but it's to determine whether or not, or to detect whether you have an issue. So going back to our very first example, and comparing that to that data we were just looking at, maybe you have an issue. All of a sudden you have this piezometer level that increases. I'm going to go back for a second. So your piezometer is coming up and all of a sudden, bang, it's up there. It's like high reservoir elevation almost. You come back here and there your piezometer kind of was expected here. Now it's coming up toward reservoir elevation. Maybe you have some sort of a blocked filter. Maybe your piezometer just got plugged. In this case, it wouldn't have got plugged because, then it would just stay static. But, maybe something else happened here, and probably operator or inspection error, right? Someone wrote something down. But if it isn't an error, remember seepage flow will increase. If if your filter is clogged and that's coming up, and you could potentially have a problem, right? So still carrying on the same sort of ideas. Let's say you have a piezometer, again, a homogeneous dam like Dwayne was showing you. Here's showing you the trend. So I'm just showing high and low elevations, just comparing that, the low reservoir elevation to the high reservoir elevation. And what you'll see is that in all the years or over a decade, all this data, all these data points would be getting collected between here and quite, at an expected location, with a bit of noise, hence this highlighted area of light blue. But let's say the next year comes around and, we see the data is looking okay, but we're seeing some values that might be coming out of our noise. We're not really sure if we have an issue. At the end of a year, and remember they say at least every year you want to analyze and interpret your data if it's necessary, instrumentation and so on and so forth. You should at the end of the year know whether or not you might have a problem. So you can at least have more attention to some of the field inspection or surveillance in the spring. You may even want to think about managing your freshet values, because you're going into the next year. Usually this is done at the end of the year in the fall or in quiet season. So maybe you have some sort of a backward erosion or something happening, right? Remember the piezometer levels have dropped in this case. So year 12, okay, now we've increased our monitoring, we've been watching, maybe we see some more seepage, maybe not. But what we do see is a very clear trend on this instrumentation data. We go from year 10, 11, 12. We probably should figure out at this point or detect that we have a problem. That piezometer is not doing what's expected. The dam may not be performing as expected, and we might actually have a internal erosion problem. So, and this is what we're trying to avoid. Year 13, if no one's at the wheel, whether or not this data is being collected, if it's not being interpreted, if you're not responding as planned, because once you figure out what your trend is, you should figure out what values should be considered outlier values and what's the next thing to do. So remember, your job as a dam owner is to detect the problem so that you can make sure it's safe. So maybe in year 11 or in year 12 is when you want to reach out and figure out what to do next if you don't have the resources in-house to do so. So this is what we're trying to avoid. It's moving, and in this case, the piezometer level is going closer and closer. Yeah, I mean, you see that trend. So other considerations, instrument may be representative of local conditions only. We talked about that throughout the past 2 hours. Remember, that point may not as loudly, show what the conditions may be if it's far away, right? Because we're at a discrete point. If it's several meters away, we might not be capturing that particular, how bad it might be. So we have to always be thinking about that. We always, visual inspection it covers the entire visible part of the dam and surroundings, but it also overlaps a lot. What's happening typically has some visual indicators as well, or other instrumentation can pick up on these things. Record keeping is key. Even if you pick up on all these things, if it's not communicated, especially if you have more than one person taking on these responsibilities or recording the data, it's essential that it's consistent, that a continuity of information is kept and recorded, so that it can be properly analyzed and that a change can be detected. And finally, analysis. And the idea is that analysis we need all these pieces. We need the reservoir elevation, otherwise we don't, you need all these pieces to be able to properly analyze it. But then the thing is, if we analyze it, we also still need the items in place or the protocols in place to be able to actually do something. Because if we don't do anything, then the whole process really has no value if we're not doing anything at the end and ultimately taking action.
Aaron,
right?
I mean, a real key takeaway. Yeah, if you want to remember anything at all, if you are doing some monitoring and you have instrumentation,
yeah,
plot it.
Yeah.
Create the plots, and two types of plots: value versus time, and value versus reservoir elevation. Those two types of plots. So plot it two different ways, and then start to build your baseline and start to look for changes of condition.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's lots of examples that looking at the data, you can go, okay, well, I can put this in Excel like this. And lots of YouTube videos out there how to use Excel if you're not, if you don't have a lot of experience using Excel. There's a lot of ways you can do that. Okay, so summary, per the regulation, I'm going to summarize back to that. So install the instrumentation necessary to adequately monitor the dam, okay? So maintain that instrumentation, collect readings from the instrumentation at a useful frequency, plot the data, and then you want to review, analyze, and interpret that data. And of course, what's not here is to respond, right? If it's outside of that, then you do have to act. But I'm summarizing the regulation here. And in the dam emergency planning and other things, the action is part of the regulation as well, just not part of specifically instrumentation. So summary continued, understand how and where. So this is some of the stuff we try to provide is understand how and where your dam is susceptible to these types of failures, and also understand what these types of failures are, what this internal erosion looks like, and tie all the other past webinars we have about visual inspection and surveillance to this instrumentation, and it's a full package of understanding. And finally, measure and plot to establish normal instrumentation values under safe operating conditions. So sometimes when you start out for the first time, you don't know if they're safe operating conditions yet, but typically you don't want to see a change in the trend, right? I mean, if it's up and down reservoir, up and down reservoir, but you don't want the condition to be changing over time. And even if it is already outside of a safe operating condition or normal, you'll typically see changing conditions, even if you start after you're already in normal conditions. So if you measure unexpected values, it is likely indicating worsening dam performance. Therefore, immediately investigate the causes. So, and that's really the takeaway. And of course, we have the dam safety website. We have contacts on there. Your dam safety officers are excellent resources. You can call them. Many of you probably have experts that you may use for inspection time and then. So use your dam safety officers, and when you have detected a problem, follow up on it, contact someone. Here's the summary. I think we have everyone on there. And these do change from time to time, so you do want to use that last website there. Just search BC Dam Safety, it's the first thing that comes up. You can get the contacts. So I just want to thank everyone